I'd like to introduce Dr. Rob Butler. He's president of the Pacific Wildlife Foundation. He's internationally known, who's recognized for his distinguished work in Canadian Wildlife Service for his numerous publications. He's also just recently received the 2015 Vancouver Aquarium Murray Newman Award for Significant Achievement.
Way to go, Rob.
I'm going to be talking about shorebirds, predators, and fear, obviously. This is some work that we've been doing over the last 10 to 15 years. And I think once you've heard this talk, you're probably going to see the world differently. I've had people tell me this, that when they go out and they look at nature, after hearing this, they see the world differently. So maybe we'll change a few minds and things tonight when you hear all about this. But before I do that, let me just tell you quickly a little bit about the Pacific Wildlife Foundation. As Jean mentioned, we're in Canada, based out of Port Moody, which is right near Vancouver. Been running for over 30 years. And it's a group of scientists from mostly around Vancouver, but we also have some in Alaska and Chicago as well. And the scientists are conducting a whole variety of work around the coast. And the idea is to try to make it easier for scientists to get out and do work using a nonprofit. And so we provide boats and facilities and so on, and we do a lot of educational work, a lot of work with film and so on. One of the key things that we want to do with it is to try to communicate the ideas out to the public in a new way, some novel ways. And so we're working on a documentary right now on the Salish Sea, and it's being done in an entirely new way with new types of technology and so on. And the concept is to try to engage people on a much broader level than we have in the past, and to get the scientists to talk in a way that everybody understands. So that's what kind of the things we're doing. Rod McVicker is here. He's one of the directors of the Pacific Wildlife Foundation. Rod, do you want to just put your hand up here? So Rod's around too. And Rod is the recipient of the Prime Minister's Award for Environmental Education. He's renowned in Vancouver. He's won all kinds of awards and so on. He's an amazing guy. So, okay, enough of that. We want to talk about shorebirds. And this little quote here kind of sums it up. This is Henry Beston, you know, from The Outermost House. This is a classic American natural history story of a man who spent a year on Cape Cod. And one of the things that he said in there, with these, when he was looking at shorebirds, he says, "Swift as the wind they fly, speeding along the breakers with the directness of a runner down a course, and I read fear in their speed." This was written in the 1930s. I read fear in their speed. A lot of people didn't really pay too much attention to what that fear actually meant, and you're going to hear about it tonight. One of the other ones, this is Saul Widensall's book, The Living on the Wind, and if you haven't seen this or read this book, I heartily recommend you pick it up. He writes, "Bird migration is the world's only true unifying natural phenomena, stitching the continents together in a way that even the great weather systems fail to do so." And I've highlighted great weather systems, so you're going to find out the role of the great weather systems as well in the migration of sandpipers here on our coast. So the theme is here. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things we did early on in the discovery in Panama of where some of these shorebirds go. I'm going to talk a little bit about wind power, how the birds make these flights. Then we're going to talk about the return of the falcon, and this is where the fear aspect of the story comes in. And then the last bit I'm going to tell you about is biofuel, which is something new, brand new thing that we've just discovered. So you're going to get to hear this here tonight. This is the sandpiper, the western sandpiper that migrates up our coast. There's probably 3 to 4 million of them that make this flight. They do it every spring. So the end of April, out here on the Skagit River, the Fraser River estuary, you can see 20,000 maybe on the Skagit, and anywhere from 100 to 200,000 on a single location in the Fraser Delta. So there's huge numbers of them make this migration. And as you can see, they're a beautiful little bird. And they are a remarkable animal. How did this all get going? Well, back in the 1980s, I was working on great blue herons, and I was spending a lot of time looking at the local heron. And as you probably know, our heron is a resident subspecies. It doesn't migrate. And I got very interested in the whole way that herons apportion their time. What is it that really dictates where herons go? It ends up that the tide plays a real critical role. So when the tide is down, they can go down and feed, and when the tides get lower and lower during the day as the summer progresses, they get more food. When they get enough food, they can produce eggs, and then they can have young. And this became a pretty clear story that what was going on locally was really important. While I was watching them, so way back in the 1980s, there were all these little western sandpipers all running around on the beach as well. So I started to get interested in this, thinking, well, if the great blue heron doesn't migrate, and if the tide and all the beaches play an important role, what about those sandpipers that only touch down here just for a few days, but migrate somewhere else? What is it that's so important to them? So look at a species that, like the heron that doesn't move versus one that is highly migratory, and try to figure this out, because these could become models for us for our environmental assessments and various other things in the Wildlife Service. So this is the little beast that I started to study, the western sandpiper, and they weigh about 25 grams. They're tiny little birds, and they're incredible migrants, which you'll hear about. So the first thing I wanted to do is, back in the 1980s, we knew that they disappeared on migration down into Mexico and probably beyond, but we didn't really know where they went. And I was at the International Ornithological Congress, and I saw this fella walking up the stairs from Panama. He had a little name tag on. So I went over to him, and I didn't speak any Spanish. He spoke very little English, but we spoke science. And I said, Calidris maori, which is the scientific name, and he goes, yeah, see. We put it together. Yes, they're in Panama. And so the following year, I flew to Panama, and I met up with him, with Francisco Delgado. This is the fellow, who is a very avid naturalist, lives in Chitre in western Panama. And he's involved in a lot of the social things, a lot of social programs there, getting the public out. He has a radio program every day. And I actually learned quite a bit from him on how to start to connect with the public. He gets a lot of people involved in all of his projects. Anyway, he told me that just outside of Panama City, there were large flocks of these sandpipers, but they weren't really sure how many there were. And so we should try to find out. So this was right after the invasion. You remember when with Noriega, and this is immediately after this. I flew into Panama City, and I saw all these sandpipers. And he said, you know, there's a lot of mines out there in the mud, and there's a cholera outbreak. And I thought, I guess we don't need to really protect this. It's fairly well protected. But we need to really look at it and see how important this is. And so with Francisco and Guy Morrison, my colleague, we flew all of Panama and recorded where there were sandpipers. And we produced this Atlas of Panama, in which you can see these huge flocks of sandpipers. There were several other people. Brian Watts was working down there as well on some of these sandpipers, and over the years we got several students involved. And gradually, with the public and with Francisco's help, we were able to, with their team, band about 15,000 sandpipers with special color bands. And we had color bands for each country throughout the Americas. So if you saw it anywhere on the migration, you knew where it came from. So that was kind of cool. Back in those days, we didn't have the technology to use the transmitters and so on to find out where these birds were going. We were just using this very old technique. Well, here we are in the Fraser Delta. So here's the western sandpipers on migration. And lo and behold, there were probably 100,000 sandpipers out on the beach that day. I set up a mist net, and in flew a sandpiper that I caught in the net that we'd banded in Panama. So this bird was banded in Chitre. We know all about it. And this bird had flown all the way up, and here I had this bird. So we now had the connection between the Fraser Delta and Panama. And since then, we've been able to connect with lots of other countries as well. We know where the migration route is and so on. One of the amazing things about this is one of our students we put down in Panama discovered that these birds use the same stretch of beach every year. So these birds will fly from Panama up to Alaska where they breed, fly back, and they'll be on the same stretch of beach. And you can go a few hundred meters one way or the other, and you'll find a different group of sandpipers. Not only that when you catch them, you tend to catch the same birds together in the net. So it means they're together as a flock as well, and they're going back to the same location. This is quite typical of sandpipers to do this, but think about it, 11,000 kilometers back and forth, and they go to the same stretch of beach. It was kind of an interesting idea. So now we knew that there were huge numbers there, and we found also there's big numbers in Mexico and many other places. We've had a lot of students that are involved in it. But here is the migration route. I've put in here, if you're interested in any of these things, these are the references if you want to look any of them up. So this is pretty much a sort of a rough idea of the migration routes. Going north, you can see the pink line there. Some of them, the ones from Panama going up to western Mexico, San Francisco Bay, Grays Harbor, out here on the Skagit, the Fraser, up to the Stikine in Alaska, the Copper River, and then to the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta right in western Alaska where they breed. Some of them go over to Siberia as well. So that's the migration route. When they're coming back, they cut across the Gulf of Alaska, coming in here along our coast, and then some of them cut across country, going across to Kansas and even down into the Everglades. So it's quite a remarkable migration that these birds are capable of doing. So we got interested in this, like, how do they do this? How do they make this migration every year? Well, one of the things we were able to do is with Chris Iverson, first with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, or U.S. Forest Service, we put a few transmitters on in San Francisco and on the Fraser, and we were able to pick them up again in the Stikine. And so we knew that by using these transmitters, we could follow the migration. So we got really carried away and put on a lot of transmitters on these birds, and we worked out how long they stay at each location. And the reason for that is that, here's one of the fundamental problems in estimating bird populations. If you see a flock of birds on the beach, you don't know how many have been there for 1 day and how many have been there for 2 days or 5 days. So you don't know if you're multiple counting or not. If you know how long they stay, you can kind of calculate that all out. It ends up that they only stay for a few days at each of these sites, 3-4 days, and then they fly on. They move on up the coast. So they stop down for a short period of time, and then they'll make a flight of several hundred kilometers, sometimes even further, on these long, long flights. One of the really remarkable things is when we first did this, we had a Sandpiper that left San Francisco Bay and 40 hours later was in the Copper River Delta in Alaska. So that's 3,200 kilometers. So if you do the math, that's 80 kilometers an hour. These birds only fly at 40 kilometers an hour. So that was a dilemma, right? We started to think, how does this all work? Wind power, that's how they do it. This is what we think. The birds take advantage of the winds along our coast to make this flight. So if we look at our coast here, look at our coastline, you can see this is, we're down here at Orcas Island, and you can see that the coastline of British Columbia is pretty rugged. And so it means the birds have to do a flight to the next location up in the Stikine to approximately 800 kilometers, about 500 miles. Over this rugged country. And we know from being up along our coast and that the birds don't settle down, that they do fly right through, and we know from the transmitters that they make this flight right through. But they need to do it much faster than what we thought they could fly. So what I did is I made a little accounting exercise. I got the birds, I took a group of them in San Francisco Bay, and I know how long they stay, and I know how much fat they put on each day, and I know how much they burn each day to fly. And I added this all up, and if they stopped at each site, how heavy would they be when they get to Alaska? It ended up that they would be depleted. They don't have enough fat to be able to do this. So I said, there's something that's helping them, and it's this wind. It came out that this is the wind that is the really critical piece to this, making this flight. And how does it all work? Well, you've probably watched these weather patterns from when the weather people are telling you the weather's changing. You'll see that there's a low pressure system starting to form out in the Gulf of Alaska, and you see the winds going around it, the counterclockwise winds. These are the winds that push these birds along. So I went to the weather stations all along the coast, and I got the balloons. They release them every 12 hours, and they tell you the wind speed and the direction and so on, all the way along the coast. And I put that into my little migration model. And sure enough, it works. When you put the wind in, they double their speed, and they're able to make these long flights. So if you think, there's a bird right here at this pink arrow down in San Francisco, and you get this nice low pressure system coming in. They get onto the wind, and it just carries them all the way along and right up to Alaska. If the winds aren't as strong, they will stop somewhere else along the way. And it appears that they need this wind. We now know that it's not just these sandpipers that do this. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and tell you about an insect. It's called the Globe Skimmer, which is a great name. The Globe Skimmer is a dragonfly, and it gathers in India every year in huge numbers in the fall. And it does this flight to South Africa. And it was discovered by a naturalist, Charles Anderson, who was working in India. And he had seen all these dragonflies there in India. But when he went to the Maldives, to the islands, he saw big numbers there as well. And he thought, what are they doing here? There's no wetlands. And he kind of pieced this together. He found out that all these dragonflies arrive several weeks later in South Africa. And they have since put this together, that this dragonfly flies across the Indian Ocean using the winds. It's the tailwind that gives them the assistance. They do it at a high elevation. The really cool thing is that it takes them 6 to 8 generations coming back, each one doing a separate leg of the journey up through Africa, across the Middle East, and back to India. So it takes 6 generations to get back. They've now found out that it looks like, using some stuff, it's a way of looking at the chitin in the laying down of the chitin, you can tell where they hatched. And it looks like they came north of the Himalayas. So they probably crossed the Himalayas, and then they fly across them. And they do this with this wind. Another colleague of mine, Bob Gill, was working with bar-tailed godwits, which make the western sandpiper seem like, it's just a walk in the park. The bar-tailed godwit gathers in western Alaska, flies to New Zealand, nonstop, 7 days. It's a 7-day flight, nonstop, the whole way over the ocean. And again, they use the winds to get going on the flight and then, complete the long flight. So what we're discovering is that these animals are remarkable things, remarkable what they're capable of doing. It just puts somebody like one of these Tour de France cyclists to shame. You think about this, what this takes, the physiological ability. Many of these are at high elevation, by the way. They're up above about 3,000 feet. So they're catching the high elevation winds and making these flights. And we're now discovering all kinds of animals are capable of doing this, and it's kind of opening our eyes to this. And I always find this fun, that when you have a preconceived idea, and I particularly think it's my preconceived idea and it's wrong, and you discover it using the data. This is the beauty of the science, is that it opens up your eyes to something entirely new. So here we are in Western Alaska. This is Brett Sandercock's work. He did his Ph.D. up there. There's the little nest with the sandpiper eggs, and the little one hatches out. By the end of June, the first adults are on their way south and are arriving here in the Salish Sea. The end of June. So summer has just started, the first day of summer, and we're starting to see them going south. These are the adults, and by the end of July, most of the adults will be south of us, and in August, all the young will come. So the young have never done this flight, but they seem to know which way to go. So you have all the young ones here in August flying south. So one of the questions for them is, when they're coming south, is where to settle and find food and so on after they've made this flight, either going north or south. Where should they go, and how should they decide where to settle? There's lots of beaches and things to look at. And this is the story of the predator I want to tell you about. And this is a concept we came up called the predator landscape. So imagine out here around through the San Juan Islands, there would be places that are safe because you can see predators, and there will be places that are dangerous because it's harder to see them. And all animals will do this. We are now discovering that ecologists are finding that there's a whole suite of species who are responding to the safety of places or the danger based on the predators, that the predator is playing a key role. You probably heard the story in Yellowstone National Park. Does everyone know that story? Or most people have heard the story? This is where they introduced a few wolves, a handful of wolves, into the park, and it changed the behavior of the elk, which then changed the vegetation. So those are those ripple effects that go all the way through. We now know, just as of a couple of weeks ago, some work here on great blue herons, the same thing happens. When the herons are not in the eelgrass bed, there's a whole change that takes place in the eelgrass. Same thing happens here with the presence of these predators, that they have an effect on the behavior of the prey, which then has all these ongoing effects. So think of it like that there are places that are safe, and there are times that are safe and ones that are dangerous. So the Fraser River Delta is a pretty safe place. As you can see, it's wide open like this. Any predator coming, the sandpiper could see that. And so that's a pretty good place to be, right? It's a nice, safe spot, good place to feed. But a place like Sydney Island, where we did a lot of our work, you can see it's enclosed. And this little bay in particular in the middle there is where a lot of the sandpipers went. With a peregrine falcon coming in hunting them, you can see they'd be caught. They'd be surprised. And so I started to do some work here on this place and on the Fraser. And over the years, we started to get all this information on the sandpipers. We lived in this little cabin out there and spent the summer there. And this is the falcon's view of it. So this is what a falcon will see coming in for a sandpiper, and it can do a dive, stoop down and catch them, or it could just skim along the surface and catch them with their heads down feeding. But it's a small area. A falcon can easily pick out the sandpiper and pick them off. So what we did is we put nets up like this. These are called mist nets. You string them up on the beach, and they're like a fine hair net. Sandpipers fly into the net. You take them out, quickly get them out of the nets. You band them, measure them, weigh them, and let them go. And so we did this with a cohort of sandpipers each day, and that gave us information on the numbers of sandpipers and how long they stayed and their weights and so on. And one of the things we discovered was that the weight of the sandpipers on Sydney Island was dropping off. It was dropping quite dramatically over the 10 years. On the Fraser Delta, they weren't. The weights were the same. So the immediate thing is something's happened on Sydney Island. The food isn't as good or whatever. But that's not the case. We actually measured the food too, and you can take a little drop of blood and you can look at the fattening rates. It ends up that actually Sydney Island's a great place to feed. So it's not anything to do with the food. And we realized that the falcon numbers were starting to come back. After the era with DDT, the numbers of falcons has been increasing, and all of them across North America and actually around the world are changing. So the numbers of falcons have been growing over time. Fortunately, because I'm one of these crazy naturalists, I keep track of all this stuff, so I had 10 years of records of peregrine falcons as well. And we showed that indeed, as the peregrine falcon numbers went up, the weights of the birds went down. The reason for that, we think, is that if you take a sandpiper that's lean and let it go, it can take off much faster than one that's fat. You know, it just takes off faster. Most of the peregrines catch their prey either on the ground or just as they're leaving the ground. So a sandpiper that's really fast gets away. And we discovered that as the numbers of falcons went up, these weights were going down. We think it was because it's more dangerous. And we found this on many other locations now as well. It's the same thing that's going on. So they're aware of the falcons, and the numbers of sandpipers using them is different. And what we think goes on is that a sandpiper that flies across the Gulf of Alaska might have been a tough flight for it. It comes in, it doesn't have very much weight, and it can escape because it is light, but it wants to fatten up, because if it can get the fat, it can do a flight to Kansas and whatever. So it wants to fatten up. If you go to the Fraser, it's nice and safe, but you know, there's not as much food there. It'd be better to go to somewhere like Sydney Island, fatten up, and then go to the Fraser. And that's what we think is going on, is that they're making this choice. They're actually deciding where to go. We've now subsequently done, with one of my Ph.D. students, Andrea Pomeroy, looked on the beach itself. And there's changes, I'll tell you about that in just a second, of how they are responding even on the beach. It's not just between beaches, but actually on the beach. But let's just talk about this little thing about danger and peregrine falcon. So here we are. This is a year here in the Salish Sea, starting January through to December. And those numbers of falcons kind of gives you the indication of the numbers that are around. So from January to April, there's pretty good numbers. And as you can see, the numbers increase up into April, and then they drop off. We have a few around through the summer, not very many. And then towards the end of the summer into August, early September, the numbers start to pick up again, and we get good numbers in the fall, and then we get back to these winter numbers. So there's kind of a little thing. So you can see that there's an area in there when there's not many falcons around, and that's the safe area. We call it the Valley of the Shadow of Death. And so, remember I told you about all those sandpipers migrating through in June? That's where they come through, right? So here's how it goes. So in the fall, it's a pretty dangerous time. There's lots of falcons around. In the spring and through the winter, it's pretty dangerous as well. So here we are. These are the adults. The adults come through right there in the middle. So it's a safe time going through. The juveniles, these are the young of the year, they come a little bit later. So you wonder what's going on here. Well, here's the story. Meanwhile, back in Panama, if you have a look at this, you'll see that all these birds have to go through a feather molt. And the adults are going to lose their wing feathers. And it happens sometime in the end of the summer. So the last thing you want to be doing is molting and losing all those feathers when all the peregrines are here. So what they do is they come through a month ahead, and they get to Panama. They go through the feather molt. They get all fresh feathers by the time the peregrine arrives. So they're ahead of it. In the case of the young birds, they have fresh feathers. They're only a month old. They've got fresh feathers. They don't have to go worry about the molt. They just migrate through and go right down to the breeding ground, or to the wintering ground. So we think that the reason they're migrating and leaving so early out of Alaska is this danger from the peregrines on this migration. So here's how it kind of works. That purple line along there is the migratory line of peregrine falcons. They arrive earlier here on our coast than they do on the east coast, and that has some important implications. And so that's in August, and here is in October when they finally arrive in Alaska. So think of this as the wave of migrating peregrines. In front of it, there's very few peregrines. Behind it, there are very few peregrines. This is the wave, the migration wave of the peregrine. That's the tsunami that moves down through North America every year. And so we think that the migration is all dictated by this. The return of these peregrine falcons and what they do determines when these sandpipers will migrate. We have another one here in the winter, the Dunlin. The Dunlin goes to western Alaska after the peregrines have left. They go through a feather molt and they wait till the peregrines are gone, and then in November they come down. So they come after the migration, and they spend the time here. The last thing they'd want to do is come here and go through a molt just as all the peregrines come down. So they wait until it's gone and then they come after it. So we think this has a key role in the whole migration of these sandpipers, this migration of peregrine falcons. On the east coast, it's a little bit later, and the migration of the sandpipers is later as well. So here we are. This is Sydney Island, and as you can see, it's quite enclosed, and so there's lots of food. It's quite dangerous. The sandpipers are quite lean, although they can fatten up quickly, and they don't hang around for very long. They don't stay there very long because of that. We think because it's dangerous. Whereas the Fraser is quite the opposite. It's safe, it's wide open, there's less food. The sandpipers are already fat, and they fatten more slowly. So you can kind of get an idea of this conservation story here. You can see the dynamics in this. You don't want to just protect the Fraser, because some of the birds might need those other places to fatten up. You don't want to protect just places like Sydney Island, because others need the Fraser. You need to have the mix of them. And we think that it's actually a game that's going on between both the peregrine and the sandpipers on how this will all play out. So I was telling you about Andrea's work on the beach and how there is a difference in how birds use the beach as well as between beaches. So this is Boundary Bay, and you can see all the sandpipers there, the white line of sandpipers. You notice that there's a line of sandpipers and then there's a line of mud without any sandpipers? Andrea started to look at this, and using a series of experiments and using transmitters and so on, she realized that the sandpipers, as they get fatter, stay further offshore. The best food is right up here, right up in the marsh. But this is like Sydney Island, right? If you're down here feeding, a peregrine can come in and catch you very easily. So you're only going to do that if you're lean. It's not a good idea if you're fat, because you're going to get caught. So the fatter they get, the further off they go. And she was finding as they fattened up here on the beach, they went further and further off the beach. So you can tell, based on the location on the beach, just how fat these birds are. So they're making really complex decisions. You may wonder, okay, well, what's so important about that line that's right there? Okay, so this is the danger zone. Here's the safety. That line in there is approximately 300 meters from the edge of the dike. If a peregrine falcon is coming in after a sandpiper, if a sandpiper sees it at 300 meters and takes off, the sandpiper will be at maximum acceleration by the time the peregrine's on it, if you have 300 meters. If it's shorter than that, the peregrine will catch it before it's got full speed. So we think the sandpipers know this, that we're safe up to here, but if you go in there, well, that's just going to be really dangerous. So you think about this, you think of these animals, they're all just sort of bird brains. There's nothing going on. Well, that's not the case at all. These are highly sophisticated animals making those migratory decisions on the wind, flying together and making those flights, doing this with the peregrine falcon, this sort of this dance between the falcon and the predator. And it makes you really start to think differently about these animals. So when you go out here and you see ducks down on the beach, and you watch them and you say, why aren't they in closer on the beach? It might be because there's an eagle sitting up there. It's not that the eagle is attacking them, but they see the eagle, and the fear from that eagle is enough to change their behavior. And that's what I mean. Now you'll probably see the world differently. When you go out there and see some of this stuff, think of it not just with the birds, but all these other animals that you're seeing. We know this goes on across a whole suite of species, that they're responding to their predators, and it's merely the presence of them. And also think about this in terms of things like DDT. When a lot of these birds of prey were removed, gone from the environment, of course all the prey behave differently. And they have had 30, 40 years of the life of Riley. And now the peregrines and all these are coming back, and we're starting to get a new balance going on here. It's all being reestablished. Think of it in terms of when we take sharks out of the ocean, or salmon, or any of the predators, all of this will have some kind of effect like this, some of these indirect effects. We are very early in our studies on this. Ecology's maybe 70, 80 years old, whereas physics and chemistry has been around for 300 years. We're very early, just beginning to understand some of these concepts, but this is one that is becoming more and more widely understood in the ecological literature, and it really makes us think differently about how we do our conservation work. Okay, the last piece I want to talk to you about is this new discovery of biofilm as a source of fuel for sandpipers. And this was work that my colleague Bob Elner and Tomohiro Kuai from Japan discovered a few years ago. Biofilm is this, if you go out on the mudflats, it's sort of like, when you take chocolate pudding and you put it in the fridge and after a few days you get that kind of gooey layer on it. If you go out on the mud, you'll see the same kind of thing. It's kind of a gooey surface. It's actually produced by diatoms and bacteria and so on. It's called biofilm, and biofilm is widespread. And it's full of carbohydrate and other things, but it's all on the surface, on the mud like this. While we were doing all this work with sandpipers, we were watching and trying to see what they ate because it was important to work out how much fat they put on. You kind of wanted to know what the diet was. And we were watching these things and thinking, they're hardly getting anything. They pull up the odd worm, but their bills are going bang, 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 3 times a second. Dab, 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 dab. Well, Tomohiro came over. He got a special camera, a high-speed, high-definition camera, especially made by Sony for him to do this, and filmed this. And what they discovered is that these birds are going around dabbing the surface of the mud. They have a special tongue with lots of little vibrissae on the end of it. They have a special bill where they can scrape the stuff off. And he used a thing using it's called looking at isotopic signatures, but he was able to trace the source of the fat on these birds. And they find that upwards about 50% of the fat that they put on comes from the biofilm, the mud on the surface, the stuff that's growing on the surface. They're just going around and dabbing it off the surface and licking it up, eating the mud. And it's enough to put on all this fat. This is a new food web for estuaries. So this is one in which you're going from a diatom right to a bird. And they're now finding that many of the sandpipers around the world are doing this. And it's giving us a new view of this, of where the sandpipers are going. So one of the things we're quite interested in is, do these sandpipers actually see this when they're flying over? Can they actually see the biofilm? Some birds are able to see in the ultraviolet side of the spectrum. Can they actually see this? Because we're finding now that there's large numbers of sandpipers settling where there's biofilm, and they may be targeting this stuff. We're starting to also think that there may be a much wider connection on this migration, that the timing of the production of the biofilm may be really critical to it. And we're starting to look at this idea that the freshet of the Fraser River is providing the nutrients in the springtime and allows a bloom of this biofilm on the mudflat just as the sandpiper comes through. So starting to think more and more about a lot of these connections. Anyway, this is a big story I could talk to a long, long time about all these things, but you've got a sort of a smattering of what we've been trying to do here and achieve. We're fortunate that now we have all of the sites, the major migratory sites under the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, which is an international program. All of that's in place. And through the support of the U.S. Forest Service now, we're surveying sandpipers throughout the Western Hemisphere with citizen scientists all the way down into South America, looking at the numbers of birds and the changes and why they might be changing. So I think that's pretty exciting, and we've managed to work out this whole story. And you think back in the 1980s when pretty much all we knew was they went into Central and South America. We knew virtually nothing about it, but a whole pile of studies have come out now, and it's one of the best studied, longest studied, and well-studied birds in North America. And it's thanks to these people. So there's a whole suite of people. Many of them are students. Some of them are professors and scientists and so on. And the story that I'm telling you is really their story that we've collected over the years. Now I want to just close on one thing, and this is the Salish Sea Legacy. Of course, having all these sandpipers here, I think, is a really important part of our story. There aren't many places that have this. In Vancouver, the city has got very, very enthused about this, and we now have Bird Week, which is going on. It's been approved with a bird strategy for the city, and the city is really ramping up. We will be holding the International Ornithological Congress in 2018, the biggest one in the world in Vancouver. The city is getting behind this in a big way, largely because of the sandpipers, but not entirely. There's lots of other birds too that are going through. But I think that for all of us, this is part of our legacy. We are very fortunate to have this. People come to this part of the world and they say, it's so beautiful, and all the nature that's around us. But the one thing that we're missing is we haven't tied it strongly into our culture yet. And we need to start thinking about that. How do we bring that in? One of them, I think, is the science. Science is part of our culture. And so organizations like the Sea Dock Society, Friday Harbor, the labs, play a critical role in this of bringing science to answer and tell stories like this. To me, these kind of stories are as exciting as any human drama. And we need to get these stories out, get people really celebrating them. And we need to find a way to really make it ours, to make it part of who we are, define who we are, and make them iconic pieces. One of the things I noticed, we're working on a film about this whole thing with the Salish Sea. And one of the things I noticed as we travel around the Salish Sea is we tend to value what we have here against things somewhere else. We do this all the time. We do it with our art, we do it with our music, we do it with everything. Why aren't we starting to value it against what we have here? Why haven't we done it? We have some of the best migratory bird places in North America, and we should be proud of that and protecting those. So that is part of that Salish Sea Legacy, and I would hope that support with organizations like the Sea Dock Society and other ones is one way to do it, but get involved. Just spend some time watching these birds too and try to understand what they're doing. See if you can see any kind of this fear going on. You'll see it around the eagles for sure. The eagles will be showing that fear. And remember, it's not that the predators are actually killing the prey, although they do it. It's that the prey senses that it's a dangerous thing and they act differently. So you'll see the world very differently now, I think, with your eyes opened. So with that, I will end it. And if you have any questions, I'd be delighted to answer. Thank you.